women have to keep spreading out to look for opportunities, to go and see the other side of the hill, the other side of the mountain. There might be something there. I think the most remarkable thing is just the pure courage that these men had to go to places unseen, unknown, unmapped. If they were going to go to Idaho or going to go to Montana, they had no real idea how far it was except in terms of time.
And you can imagine 50, 60 Chinese men walking across the landscape, each carrying everything they possibly would need, food, clothing, tools. They walked. That's how they got here, to the Mountain of Gold.
Americans thought the Chinese were submissive and wouldn't fight back. But that wasn't true on the frontier. That's a false image.
It's fair to say that the story of the Chinese in Idaho doesn't loom large in American history. Their names and faces have mostly been lost. But in Idaho, the Chinese found their own true frontier, where the odds were not so heavily against them. And there was one whose name survives. The Chinese called her La Luna Toy. To Americans, she was Polly.
She came on a pack train, a string of horses. The pack train had to follow a trail, single file, going down the mountain canyon to the mining camp. She probably had to ride a horse because there was just too many miles to walk. And being property, being owned by somebody, that merchant want Polly here in good condition.
You could not have a less promising start in America than La Luna Toy. She arrived a slave.
It was a period of extreme chaos in China. A lot of families were extremely poor and could not afford to bring up their daughters, so they sold them and they took the girls to America. The girls themselves did not know what they were coming to America to do. Only after they came to the U.S. did they discover that they were sold here to become prostitutes.
Slavery after the Emancipation Proclamation. It was a sordid episode in American history, the work of ruthless Chinese profiteers aided by corrupt U.S. officials. Few Chinese women were coming to America, fewer still to Idaho. But of these, most were prostitutes held against their will. La Luna Toy was put to work as a sing-song girl, a bar hostess in one of the makeshift mining towns that dotted the Idaho Territory. That may have been her first good fortune, to land in this improbable place. In the 1860s, Chinese miners moved into the Boise Basin, pooling their money to buy claims that whites thought had run dry. Soon, they were nearly half the population, and there were new names on the map like Shanghai Gulch.
To the west, we have Fuxing. Next, Linhua. Next, the Honghua Mining Company. They moved a lot of earth. Whole hillsides are missing.
And they found their gold. In a month, one group extracted $6,000 worth, equivalent to 500 years of a man's labor in Guangdong. Idaho's towns sprung to life, with Chinese everywhere, as store owners, herbal doctors, cattle drivers, lawyers, outlaws. Louis Kim served Chinese and Western food around the clock, and when the shout went out, "Ma Fan Tan La," men knew the game was on. But these saloons where La Luna Toy worked were as violent as Dodge cities. The trick was staying alive.
You couldn't depend on the police or sheriff. So the Chinese brought Bowie knives and Springfield Army rifles, Colt revolvers, Smith & Wesson pistols.
To carry weapons probably give them a sense of security. One famous Western historian once said, God had made someone large, someone small, but Colonel Colt made them all equal.
A Chinaman is slow to deeds of desperation, said one Idaho paper, but when he starts in, he generally means business. A miner named McGinnis found that out when he tried to bully some neighboring Chinese and paid for it with his life. Frontier justice, Chinese style, included late-night arson, or a delivery of firewood to an enemy, each log filled with gunpowder. Of course, whites muttered about this primitive heathen people in their midst. Of course, there were stories about John Chinaman. But out on the frontier, they had a different twist.
Once an American lady hired a Chinese cook. When Chinese went to her house and she asked the Chinese his name, the Chinese answer say, my name is Wang Hang Ho. The white lady say, oh, it's too difficult for me to remember that. Why don't I call you John? Then the Chinese smile, say, what's your name? And she answered, my name is Mrs. Melville Landon. The Chinese say, oh, it's too difficult for me to remember. Why don't I call you Tommy?
The racial animosity ran two ways. In the Chinese community, all non-Chinese were referred to as barbarians. Still, these two groups, roughly matched in numbers and guns, kept their hostilities in check. When housing was short, they would bunk down in the same rooms. If free food or music were on offer, they'd even show up at each other's parades.
It's Chinese New Year's. Got their cymbals, got their drums, took their guns, walked right down through the very East Main Street right through town. And it was a time of celebration. And even the Americans enjoyed the Chinese parade.
The celebrations would end on Main Street, where the whites played poker, the Chinese fan-tan. They could buy drinks for one of the few women in town, La Luna Toy, still a sing-song girl and still a slave. The freedom the Chinese men had grabbed was not hers, not yet. She'd find that in a dance hall down the street in the unlikely person of Charlie Bemis.
Charlie, people said he was lazy and that he started out as a miner, but that was too hard work, and so he went into maybe gambling and saloon owning and that kind of things.
He may have been thin on ambition and short on looks, but Polly saw a chance. One day, she wasn't with her Chinese owner anymore. She'd moved in with Charlie Bemis.
What I expect might have happened was that Charlie offered her the opportunity to be his housekeeper. She would have a place to live, she could make some money.
Whatever the terms, she was now free. By the time she became Mrs. Polly Bemis, the gold had been washed out of Idaho's hills, and the Chinese miners had moved on. Their women were gone too, many dead of disease and abuse. But Polly survived and settled here, catching her meals in the Salmon River, dodging anti-Chinese officials, and goading Charlie to make something of himself. From slave to frontierswoman was quite a journey, but that was true of so many Chinese, improvising lives for themselves in the 19th century American West.
When we think of pioneers, most people think of people that came across the West in covered wagons. But there were other pioneers who came here from a different direction. They came across the Pacific.
Thousands of such pioneers would be drawn from their Guangdong villages to join the boldest enterprise of the age, the drive to build a railroad east.
It was just absolutely the most dangerous and foolhardy and crazy gamble that human beings could take. That people could actually get a railroad across a 7,000-foot tall mountain range in the 1860s.
The building of the Transcontinental Railroad was probably the greatest engineering feat of the 19th century, and it shook the way whites viewed the Chinese. It would shake the Chinese worldview as well. The image of this race was never fixed. As whites' fortunes rose and fell, as their own needs changed, they would see the Chinese differently. Leland Stanford, after 2 years as governor, quit to build the rail's western leg. As governor, he joined the anti-Chinese cause, and later he joined it again. But he was an improviser, a Westerner, not about to be tied down. He and his partners, hungry for labor, would draw thousands of Chinese to America and bind them to this country as never before.
I think that Stanford is very much a businessman by then, and to him is the bottom line. And the bottom line was that he needs cheap labor to help build a railroad. And in fact, the more miles of track that he lays, the more land and natural resources that he gets from the federal government.
Well, the year that my great-grandfather came to America was 1865. Luckily, in 1865, the Transcontinental Railroad was about to be built, and he became one of those railroad workers that was hired on.
Recruited in Guangdong, mustered into work gangs at the docks, they were ferried to the California Sierras to shovel and haul away dirt and rock. They would number 11,000, almost 1 in every 5 Chinese in America.
This tunnel was built almost entirely by Chinese labor. There was nothing special about it that needed anything other than someone who could slam a hole into a rock and then get out of the way.
They cut through the Sierras one mountain at a time. When they reached the pure granite of tunnel number 6, teams were set to work from both sides, night and day, through a lethal winter. Progress was measured in inches per day.
Here are these heroes leaving China thinking that they're going to find ranges of gold mountains, and instead what they find are the Sierra Nevadas. They came from a people who believe that there are 9 hells, and when they tunneled into the Sierras, they would say, "I've entered one of the hells."
Those who perished in the cold were left where they fell. Co-workers marked the man's name and village beside him in hopes that one day his bones would be shipped home. The Central Pacific kept no record of how many died. Its focus was on the survivors, blasting their way through the rock.
In one of his reports to President Johnson, Stanford sent a letter praising the Chinese and saying if it weren't for the Chinese, we could not be building this railroad.
By 1866, the Central Pacific bosses needed more than brute labor. Could they use the Chinese for skilled work? Did they have the brains? It was not a small question in 19th century America.
There was a huge movement that had the endorsement of science as it was known then, of measuring their heads, measuring the skulls of various groups of people to demonstrate their mental capacity.
Obviously, strangely, the Europeans seem to have the best craniums for higher intellectual activities, and then by degrees, as you got further and further away from Europe, people's ability started to diminish.
And it was discovered, much to the embarrassment of the scientists, that the Chinese cranium was on the average larger than that of the white cranium. And since they wanted the white brain to be on top, they had to do something to find some way of resolving this difficulty.
The difficulties of the Central Pacific were more immediate. With the Chinese were the two men driving construction, Charles Crocker and James Strobridge.
There'd been a strike of Irish masons, and Strobridge went to Crocker and said, we're losing time on the culverts and on the walls, and he said, go hire some Chinese and set them to work making the walls, and Strobridge scoffed and said, make masons out of the Chinese, it'll never work. And Crocker's reply, they built the Great Wall of China, didn't they?
Sure enough, the Chinese were assigned skilled work as well. They served as masons and track layers and foremen.
You had the equivalent of a modern-day city up here.
Yes. At night, it was all fires, little campfires all along this whole thing. Hundreds and hundreds of campfires.
Food at the end of the day, cooked in giant woks. The wonderful smells that must have emanated on the mountainside here.
But in this makeshift community, there was also talk about how they were paying for their food and the white men weren't. How the bosses drove them for long hours and whipped them when they tried to quit.
They became aware that this was a society that allowed protest. Unlike in China, where protests might lead to getting beheaded, in this country a strike could actually get you somewhere.
Imagine 2,000 workers coming out with their big hammers to pound nails into the track. And imagine their headmen are bringing them out in groups. And they come to the tracks, and instead of starting to pound the nails, they sit down on the tracks and don't move. And the managers are saying, let's go to work, go to work. And they sit there silently. And then they pick up and go back to the tents that meager tents that they lived in on these things, and don't come out again. It must have been an awesome image.
They demanded the same pay as the white working men, and their strike slogan was 8-hour day, good for white man, all the same, good for Chinaman. They saw themselves as the equal to any white American.
At the time it happened, it was one of the biggest strikes in American history. Never before had that many workers sat down and refused to work.
The strike of the Chinamen is the hardest blow we have had, wrote one of the partners. The truth is, they're getting smart. The company's response was swift. All food supplies were cut. E.B. Crocker, brother of Charles, was there.
None of us went near them for a week. We did not want to exhibit anxiety. Then Charles went up, and they gathered around him. He told them that he made the rules for them and not they for him. Not a cent more would he give. He had the sheriff and posse come up to see that there was no fighting.
The managers thought it could never happen. A strike by illiterate villagers from across the world. But only guns and the threat of starvation got the Chinese work gangs back, hammering inside the tunnels.
No ventilators, no way to blow air into a place. The smell of black powder, blasting powder.
The smell of people.
Smell of people. When they finally broke through, after a year and a half of cutting and blasting, when they finally broke through, to read the feelings of the people as that breeze from the east came blowing through the tunnel. And all of a sudden this absolutely foul air cleared through, and there was just this sense that there was another world on the other side.
By the time Leland Stanford helped hammer the last spike at a ceremony at Promontory, Utah in 1869, he and his partners, flush with new wealth, were again singing the praises of the Chinese.
Strobridge invited this Chinese work gang to his private car, and the senior officials of both railroads were there for a dinner in which they honored the Chinese. And you can imagine the place was full of newspaper reporters from all over the country. They were recognized for what they had done.
My great-grandfather worked for $1 a day on the railroad, and he later became a foreman, and he worked so hard. It took him months to accumulate enough money to buy a gold piece that he would look at every night. He was one of those people called Gumsan Hak, which means guest of the Gold Mountain, a sojourner. And that was the term the Chinese used. In other words, you're a guest and you'll go back home. When my great-grandfather sent for his wife to come to America, that was a big, big leap, because a woman who leaves her village, and that's just not done. Women did not leave the village, and she did. And I think at that point, my great-grandfather, felt that there was a future in America, and it was a place to have children.
The Chinese lived in a state of limbo. Congress vacillated, granting them civil rights in 1870, even while refusing to make them citizens. But they'd been here 20 years. Now their temples were made of adobe and brick. Their earnings split. Some sent home to China. Some spent here, building their American communities.
Our people were all in their native costumes, with queues down their backs, and kept their stores just as they would do in China, with the entire storefront open, and groceries and vegetables overflowing on the sidewalks.
I think my great-great-grandfather started to gradually arrive at a comfortableness with America and putting down roots, as did his countrymen. And I think they didn't have to have as close and strong ties to their ancestral villages.
Some of these men settling in America were Civil War veterans. Scattered among the muster rolls were names like Charles Chin, John Afu, and Char Kwan. One who tried to enlist for the Union was the graduate of Yale College and U.S. citizen Yung Wing.
At this point in Yung Wing's life, he's employed by the Chinese government, but he also has an unswerving loyalty to the values of the United States. So therefore, while on the one hand he can attempt to enlist in the Army, at the same time he's using this opportunity to be in the United States to help modernize China.
Yung was now a businessman and an emissary for the Chinese government, shuttling between the two countries. But he was taking on the trappings of an American life.
Yung Wing not only became an American citizen, but also married an American woman.
Mary Kellogg's family welcomed him. He built a life with her in Connecticut, Christian and English-speaking. He gave his sons American names. And he cut off his Chinese queue, traditional symbol of allegiance to the emperor. He was casting his lot in with American values and ways. He didn't yet realize how much he was at risk. The new rail would slice through American life, topple the old rules of commerce, redraw the map, shake the lives of most Americans, including the Chinese. In the railroad's first year, a small-town businessman named Calvin T. Sampson came up with a bold scheme.
In North Adams, Massachusetts, little town up in the Berkshire Mountains, there's a shoe factory that's run by Calvin Sampson. There's several strikes in 1868, 1869, and 1870. And Sampson just gets fed up with having to deal with the union, to deal with the workers.
All Sampson meant to do was solve his local labor problem. But this obscure shoe manufacturer would help rouse ancient stereotypes in the American mind.
He sends one of his management to San Francisco. And they hire 75 Chinese immigrants for $1 apiece. They come across on the just completed Transcontinental Railroad. And they arrive in North Adams, Massachusetts on June 13, 1870. The Chinese immigrants are mostly teenagers. They're age 15, 16, 17, 18. My guess is that they probably don't realize the extent of what's happening. There's the scene of them stepping off the train and the whole town is gathered to see them. And keep in mind, most white Americans east of the Rockies have never seen a Chinese immigrant in their lives. They've never seen an Asian immigrant in their lives. There's a lot of tension because these Chinese immigrants are being brought in as strikebreakers. They're being brought in to take over their jobs.
It creates a kind of fear that is this the beginning of large number of Chinese coming into Massachusetts and then going into New Jersey and into Pennsylvania. The arrival of these 75 Chinese received a huge amount of attention, more so than they deserved.
It couldn't have come at a more unstable time of business booms and busts, unimaginable fortunes being made, a labor movement looking to get its share. And now, this yellow peril, Chinamen, infinite in supply, servile by nature, ready to take over every honest white man's job.
You have workers, working class leaders, union leaders, end up having demonstrations and protest meetings throughout the country. You have them in New York, you have them in Baltimore, Chicago, Boston, Albany, Philadelphia.
Now comes this Asiatic race. They will work for half price and live upon a mouse or a rat and call it a dainty morsel.
The handful of Chinese in the East, barely 200 in all, triggered economic and racial hysteria. Recruit them into the unions? No. Labor leaders had a different use for the Chinese.
They discover that they can use Chinese to mobilize the white working class and to organize themselves into a powerful political force.
There are mass meetings held by unions. There are statements of the great threat that is involved here. And so what had begun as a small-scale operation of hostility to the Chinese now became a national enterprise.
Everyone was using the Chinese, bosses as well. The yellow threat was just the tool with which to bully unions. In 1877, a New York cigar maker staged his own Chinese invasion. One Chinese man walking in and out of his plant to make workers believe more were on their way. Another hired white scabs and dressed them as Chinese, complete with cues. Chinaman became an all-purpose epithet among East Coast working men. In the West, where the Chinese lived, it would be far worse.
The Pacific coast is cursed with parasites from China, used as a weapon by grasping capitalists to oppress poor laboring men.
The speaker, was San Francisco's Dennis Kearney, a one-time sailor who had found his way west from County Cork, Ireland. He picked up a following in the vacant lots on the city's west side. His long list of enemies included the capitalist bosses, political swindlers, and railroad trusts. But he could electrify a crowd, he found, when he denounced the Chinese.
Began to give these talks to other men hanging around the sandlots at night. They'd build a big bonfire and he'd harangue them, the Chinese must go. He began to demonize the Chinese.
Kearney's audience was laborers with time on their hands. They'd come west dreaming of good jobs, but by 1873, the markets had crashed.
San Francisco fills up with the men from the agricultural fields who can't find work. There's people sleeping on the streets. There's homelessness. There is outbreaks of juvenile delinquency. Young men become very restive, beating up groups, etc. The word hoodlum is coined in San Francisco at this time to describe the young men who would huddle them, gang around somebody, huddle near them and beat them up.
The workers in California are angry at what's going on around them, and they're angry not only at the Chinese, but at what seems to them to be the rich capitalists who are keeping them down by hiring Chinese or who are refusing to give them basic subsistence wages.
Kearney gets up there. He's a young guy. He's all of 31 at this time, 31. And in California, in San Francisco, he'd give speeches practically every night, or at least every week throughout the fall of 1877. And he became the head and tail of the movement.
We have made no secret of our intentions. We make none. Before you and the world, we declare that the Chinamen must leave our shores.
And one of the dramatic moments in Kearney's speech is he opens his jacket and throws his jacket down because he gets so hot and sweaty. And that always brought big cheers, eruption of cheers among the audience. And then he would launch into this crusade or this fusillade against the Chinese that could go on for half an hour, for an hour or so.
We declare that we cannot hope to drive the Chinaman away by working cheaper than he does. None but an enemy would expect it of us. None but an idiot could hope for success.
And it's almost like a circus performance. And he gets the crowd riled up and to cheer for him. And he always ends his meetings with these anti-Chinese resolutions for the meeting to support.
My chief mission here is to secure the expulsion of Chinese labor from California. The Chinese must go. I will give the Central Pacific just 3 months to discharge their Chinamen. And if that is not done, Stanford and his crowd will have to take the consequences.
The attacks on Leland Stanford put him in a predicament. No public figure was as tied to the Chinese as he. And it wasn't just a matter of his railroad employees. He had dozens of Chinese working at his home.
He talked to an anti-Chinese group one day. They asked him for an interview, and he said to avoid problems with the neighbors and the ranchers and the townspeople, he says, I will eliminate the Chinese workers and bring in Caucasian workers.
He would keep them out of sight and dismiss them for a while, and then when the coast was clear, they'd be rehired.
Chinese lore tells of Stanford's intimate relationship with them, of herbalists brought in to treat his wife Jane, of her trying to legally adopt one of her servant boys.
He was very good to his workers, probably very good to his gardener and his houseboys, and made them very comfortable. And he probably thought, individually, I treat them well. Officially, I don't know them.
The private affections of the West's leading citizens remain just that, private. There were few protests from the mansions of Nob Hill in the 1870s as anti-Chinese violence flared.
They were lying in ambush. He came to his death by homicide. He was murdered by a thief. He committed suicide. He was choked to death with a lasso by a robber. He was strangled to death by a man. He was starved to death in prison. He was frozen to death in the snow. He was going to drown himself in the bay. After searching for several days...
In 1875, a Chinese-English guidebook appeared teaching immigrants the phrases they might need in their new country.
He was killed by an assassin. He tried to assassinate me. He tried to kill me by assassination. He's an assaulter. He was smothered in his room. He was suffocated in his room. He was shot dead by his enemy. I look at the Wong Sam's English-Chinese phrasebook as the very first history of Chinese life in America from the Chinese point of view.
In 1877, in the mining town of Chico, armed white men stormed a cabin where Chinese workers were resting and set the men on fire. That same year, gangs spent 3 nights torching the Chinese laundries of San Francisco. They were the worst riots in the city's history. It took 5,000 men to restore the peace. Wee Ken was across the bay in Oakland.
There were long processions at night with big torchlights and lanterns carrying the slogan, "The Chinese must go." We were simply terrified. We kept indoors after dark for fear of being shot in the back. Children spit upon us as we passed by and called us rats.
The Chinese 6 companies issued a chilling statement. If Chinese men were going to die, many white men would die with them. In a few short months in 1877 and 78, Dennis Kearney mobilized his own political party. His men became city council members, state senators, and soon mayor of the largest city in the West, San Francisco. In 1878, he took his campaign nationwide.
Tens of thousands of my countrymen are by law deprived of a livelihood and are being driven from their homes to starve in the streets.
Yung Wing, representing the Chinese government, spoke out against Kearney. But this educated man in his Connecticut home had never been at risk himself. The 1870s, so dangerous for Chinese laborers, had been for Yung Wing a time of fulfillment. 6 years before Kearney came east, Yung Wing realized a lifelong dream, a program of U.S.-China friendship and exchange. Students brought to America to learn and be immersed in Western ways.
At the same time, Dennis Kearney and his Working Men's Party is rising up and leading the call for the Chinese must go. Yung Wing's school is flourishing.
The main targets of the anti-Chinese movement were Chinese laborers. Yung Wing, being an educated man, being an emissary of the government, there was a class difference. And so the anti-Chinese movement was not directed at people of Yung Wing's background.
Most of the reception they got was pretty positive in the very beginning. They were seen as curiosities. They are introduced to polite society. They go to parties. They're invited to dances and teas.
They organized a baseball team called the Celestials. Sometimes they were called the Orientals. What else would you call them? They had a pitcher on the Celestials who was a southpaw. His name was Lefty. And so part of your entry into American life is you now have a nickname. Chinese nicknames are something very heroic, you know, like brave warrior, things like that, big wall, strong foundation. But in America, all you needed was a name like Lefty.
Jung's Chinese sponsors, his supervisors in the government, were appalled by what they saw. They wanted their young charges to learn, but not this, not to absorb these alien and debased customs.
The students assimilated too well into American society. The elders back home felt that they were beginning to lose a lot of the traditional Chinese ways, getting too far away from the Confucian Analects.
But Yongwing was delighted. Other Chinese following in his footsteps, soaking up New England's democratic values. This was the future, and neither his superiors nor Kearny and his unruly mob were going to stand in his way. In 1878, as Dennis Kearny toured the East, he was closely watched by the most ambitious politicians in Washington, those with designs on the White House. Here was a man turning working-class rage into growing political power. That would have gotten attention in any political season, but especially after 1876.
The 1876 election is extremely close, and Hayes is awarded the White House by a single electoral vote, closest electoral count in American history. And both parties know that the election of 1880 is going to be equally close and could go either way.
As politicians scoured the landscape for vote-getting issues, there was nothing fresh about the anti-Chinese cause. Californians had been pitching it in Congress for years, with only mild success.
In general, Easterners really couldn't care less about the Chinese either way. They're not a factor in their lives except in very small places. What they do care about, overwhelmingly, is that they don't want organized labor to take over the government. All of a sudden, out in California with Dennis Kearny and the Sandlot Gang, you've got workers joined around the anti-Chinese issue and threatening to take over government. Then Easterners start to pay attention and they get terribly, terribly nervous.
There was plenty to be nervous about. Violent strikes all over the country. And now, Kearny and his party thrashing Republicans and Democrats alike. Any politician who could steal his thunder just might help the country and help himself as well.
The Chinese are an easy target. It's a very easy group of people to throw overboard and maintain political balance in the country. The anti-Chinese movement was a perfect tool to try and grab the working class vote without actually having to do anything.
One of the most charismatic and skillful politicians of the day was James Blaine, Republican senator from Maine.
No one ever accuses Blaine of being an idealist. He's in it for the power, but he's immediately the front runner for 1880. Before this time, Blaine had never said a word about Chinese immigration his entire life, never given a speech on it, never written anything about it. If you look at his record, he had been very much in favor of black civil rights and civil rights in general, so you might expect he'd come out in favor of Chinese immigration. But he delivers a blistering attack in Congress in February of 1879.
The question lies, in my mind, thus. Either the Anglo-Saxon race will possess the Pacific coast or the Mongolians will possess it. This is servile labor, worse than slave labor, and we have this day to choose whether we will have for the Pacific coast the civilization of Christ or the civilization of Confucius.
And what's significant is not just the nastiness that Blaine uses, because other politicians had used nasty terms before. It's the fact that he is such a prominent politician and expected to be the next president or at least the next presidential candidate. He lifts the issue out of the gutter, out of the sandlots of San Francisco, and makes it respectable.
I am pleading the cause of the free American laborer and of his children and of his children's children. This is an immigration that does not observe.
Blaine and his followers brought new polish to the anti-Chinese cause. No more angry calls to arms. This was about the sanctity of the American home and protecting it from a race that cared nothing for marriage or family.
The Chinese came to take care of their families. I mean, they wanted to provide for their families back in China. That was the reason that my great-great-grandfather came.
The subtleties of Chinese life, the old ties in the village, the new ties here, were not the concern of Congress. The politics were clear. The Chinese did not have the vote. Californians and white laborers had many. In 1881, no less than 11 different bills were submitted calling for Chinese exclusion.
Should we be a mere slop pail into which all the dregs of humanity should be poured? The Chinaman can live on a dead rat and a few handfuls of rice.
The Chinese are machine-like. They are automatic engines of flesh and blood. They herd together like beasts. We ask you to secure the American Anglo-Saxon civilization without contamination or adulteration.
The Chinese do not and will not assimilate with our people. They come only to get money and return. They secretly maintain laws and a government of their own. They bring with them their filth and frightful diseases.
There's a senator from Massachusetts named George Frisbee Hoare, and he leads the argument in defense of Chinese immigration. And he talks about the evils of racism. He talks about how racism has left its hideous and ineradicable scars on every generation in American history. What's significant is that he's considered almost like a doddering fool. He's mocked for not facing up to the stern realities of the present. Maybe 15 years ago after the Civil War that could have been said, but this is a new era, and Hoare is considered outdated and out of fashion.
No one could have seemed more out of fashion than Yong Wing, with his dreams of U.S.-China friendship and exchange. He was under assault from both sides. The nation he'd held as a shining example wanted nothing more to do with his race. And his bosses back in China saw his school as a menace. The final blow came when Yong Wing tried to get his students into Annapolis and West Point, and the U.S., in violation of treaty, turned him down flat.
The answer to my application was, there is no room provided for Chinese students. It was curt and disdainful. It breathed the spirit of cronyism with which the whole atmosphere was impregnated and which had hypnotized all the departments of the government, especially Congress.
The rejection was just the excuse the Chinese needed. They closed Yong's school. He returned to China in disgrace, and the students were sent west to wait for a ship home. In Oakland, a local baseball team challenged the boys to a game.
And they take up the challenge. They play this one last baseball game, a game in which the people who came to see it think that the Chinese are going to lose the baseball game. But they have to go home.
Personality.
that had
until 18 list up his political
Kan nga niya, nakaon yung makanong babae na ikaw tali. Navan.
Bang. 花沟红龟。
Yan. Kawan niya, yun nabang uji.
盆大雨。气象局更发布了豪雨特报，而明天会不会继续下雨呢？我们现在就来告诉。
今天台湾地区的天气受到锋面的影响，在中部以北以及东北部情况。那局部地区的话，也有达到大雨的一个标准。那不过逐渐的减弱向东移动所以说在今天下午的话，气象局解除局部地区有大雨出现的一个状况。那整个北部地区，所以今偏高的状况。那至于未来的天气的话，首先来看一下今天的卫星云图。云图上可以看到锋面的云系从日本附近一直向到华南。那锋面逐渐的接近台湾地区，所以整个下午之后的话，降雨的情形有逐渐缓和下来。那至于明天的一个预测天气图的话，可以看到整个锋面云系逐渐那北明天的云到气温的话。也会逐渐的回升资料由中央气象局提供。
来看明天各地的详细气温。